Is reg maak vir die deur toe asseblief?
Kat hier, kom.
Goeienaand mense. Dat ek nou net bietjie sien wat gebeur hier. Dis my eerste vlug op StreamYard alleen. So, ek moet nou dit alles op my eie doen. So kom ons kyk net gou. Waar is die mikrofoon? En dan is ek alleen hier op hierdie stadium. So, as hier mense teenwoordig is, ag stuur vir my 'n ou boodskapie dat ek nie so alleen voel nie asseblief. Ons praat vanaand oor die OGOD hofuitspraak. Dit was in 2017 en dit lyk nie so wat vreeslik dinge verander het nie. En dis hoekom ons graag vanaand daaroor wil praat. En kom ons sit 'n bietjie lipstik aan. En dan kyk ons of dit help, of dit ons slimmer laat lyk. Ja, ek sien ons 'n paar mense hierso wat kyk. Ek's baie bly, baie welkom. Ons gas sal seker nou enige oomblik by ons aansluit. Ek is vroeg, miskien is omdat ek so opgewonde is om te sien hoe gaan vanaand verloop. So ja, kom dat ek net gou kyk. Goed. Vir die wat belangstel, julle kan solank as julle lus het om te volg en na 'n opinie te kyk. As jy op die internet ingaan en jy tik in section 27 religion, net daai 3 woorde, dan sal jy 'n baie nuttige handboek kry wat baie mooi uiteensit hoe om skole en so aan te hanteer. So, kom ek wys gou vir julle. Ek gaan sommer dit oorskakel. Ek het dit hier op my skerm. So, kom ek sit hom daar. Dis 'n vreeslike oulike handboekie. Ek verwys mense gereeld daarna, omdat dit baie nuttig is. So, daar sit hy. Section 27 het ongelooflike werk gedoen met hierdie boekie. Daar's 'n hele reeks van hulle. Hierdie een is hoofstuk 10 en hy verduidelik baie mooi hoe dit behoort te werk. Ek wil iemand wat wil vra, julle kan vir my die vrae op Facebook sit, julle kan dit as 'n comment sit. Ek sal dit vir Michael vra en dan kyk ons of ons 'n paar dinge uitgesorteer kan kry. So asseblief ouens, terwyl ons wag vir Michael Swain van 4SA om by ons aan te sluit. Hierdie is ook 'n fondsinsameling vir doen. Ek beplan groot goed vir die jaar. Onder andere is ons besig om 'n nuwe of nie 'n nuwe nie, ons is besig om 'n produk te ontwikkel. Dis nou ek en my pa, afgetrede skoolhoof, my pa nie ek nie, en raadslid van doen. Ek noem dit op hierdie stadium die, nou het ek self die naam vergeet, bietjie senuweeagtig vanaand, nê? Bietjie senuweeagtig. Die Cognitator, dit is die Cognitator, daar staan reeds 2 modelle uit. Die Cogitator. ons hoop om hom een van die dae vry te stel. Dit gaan 'n groot geleentheid wees. Ons werk daaraan. So as jy wil bydra om die cogitator die wêreld in te stuur, ek gaan bankbesonderhede ook met julle deel. Ek beloof elke sent word aangewend om die wiele aan die rol te hou. As daar iemand is wat lus het om te help om 'n webbladsy te ontwikkel, ag, asseblief, dit sal so gaaf wees. Ek sukkel my dood om te leer hoe om met alles te werk. Daar's net nie genoeg ure in 'n dag nie. So dit is die ander manier waarop jy 'n bydrae kan maak. As jy sou wou. Goed, ek gaan hierdie dokument nou eers ophou share hierso. Daar's Dean. Dean het gesê hy sal vir my help. Ek gaan vir Dean inbring. Hallo Dean, ek voel baie alleen. Jy's ook alleen.
Kom jy dan reg?
Dean, hoekom kan ek jou nie hoor nie?
Ek het my settings check, gee my 'n oomblik. Test, my klank kom deur.
Dis my kant, ek het verkeerde mikrofoon die verkeerde speakers gekies. Vir die mense wat kyk, Dean is 'n groot hulp vir my. Hy help my baie. Dean is van Atheist Republic Cape Town. Hy's by die werk vanaand, maar ten spyte daarvan het hy gesê hy sal so van die kant af vir my help. Dat ek kan nie heeltemal kop verloor nie. So baie dankie vir Dean. Ons is vroeg, ek is vroeg. Ek wou seker maak dat alles reg is en reg loop. So ja. Enige iemand dis nie wyn wat ek drink nie, hoor. Dis net 'n pink drink.
Ja. So jy het natuurlik jou agenda en alles voorberei en
Yep.
Okay, so jy's doodreg om te gaan.
Ja, sê gou vir my Dean, as ek nou wil sien wat mense se kommentaar is, as mense dalk op Facebook vir my vrae gooi, hoe gaan dit op my skerm wys?
Okay, op die regterkant van jou skerm is daar 4 knoppies: comments, banners, brand en private chat.
Ek sien, daar's comments aan. Okay,
ja, so as jy op comments klik, dan jy sien daar's reeds een, en as jy dan op die comments self klik, dan vertoon hy hom op die skerm.
Ek sien, okay, cool. Dis so maklik. Dis paar maal.
Dan klik jy net weer en dan gaan jy
weer weg. Goed, dis paar maal wat hulle oudste en enigste dogter ondersteun. So dankie julle. Ja, ek wag nou net vir Michael om by ons aan te sluit. So ja.
Ek gaan myself gou verskoon. Ek het net 'n e-pos wat ek gou moet beantwoord.
Dis doodreg. Ek is nou besig net vinnig voor jy gaan om te rekord. Hoe weet ek of ek rekord of nie?
Dit wys vir jou, laat ek net sien.
Ek sien 'n knoppie wat sê live, maar ek wil
seker so jou livestreams is in elk geval in 'n argief.
Okay.
So jy kan dit van daar af net download.
Okay.
Ja. Okay.
Goed, cool. Dankie Dean.
No problem, ek's gou uit.
Thanks. Okay, nou wag ons vir ons gas. Intussen tyd gaan ek die dokument opsit wat Forsa vir my gestuur het. Vir iemand wat dit wil deurgaan, so lank, vir agtergrond. As jy wil vra, hier is so lank 'n bietjie inligting waarmee jy dit kan doen. Forsa staan vir Freedom of Religion South Africa. So hierdie is Forsha se voorlegging oor die inhoud. So wat is definition of religious freedom? Hier is 'n bietjie geskiedenis oor Forsha. Hier is waar hulle werk. Baie belangrike disclaimer. Hierdie is nie wettige advies nie. Goed. Dit is 'n goeie opsomming van wat gebeur het. So this is a very good summary of what happened and what the case was about. Something, however, that is not mentioned, but let me see if let me not go too far ahead, and let me wait for stay. We are just waiting for Michael to join us. I sincerely hope that they do not have load shedding in Cape Town. Ek was baie bang dat ons vanaand gaan beerkrag hê, maar ons het gelukkig eers van 12:00 af beerkrag. So. Ons behoort dit te maak tot dan. En hier sit ons nou en kyk vir mekaar en wag vir Michael om te join. Ek sien nou hierso, daar was van 6:00 af load shedding in Kaapstad. So, ek gaan gou-gou vir Michael 'n boodskap stuur. Hy het vir my niks laat weet nie. So ek is seker dat hy fyn sal wees en hy het my telefoonnommer. So, kom ons wag en kyk. Kom ons wag en kyk. Elevator music, waar is jy as mens jou nodig het? Daar's hy. Michael, can you?
Greetings. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes, I can hear you. Welcome. I heard that you have load shedding.
No, we're doing all right, actually. I sincerely hope we don't have load shedding. Let me just see if there's been any change in the weather, and if so, when it's going to happen. Stage 2. According to this, it says power off tomorrow.
Okay, yes, same with us. So we should both be fine. Let's see how it goes. Michael, I'm ready to start when you are. Can you see the document on the screen before I welcome you and introduce you?
I can, and you're going to go back to the first slide, correct?
To the first slide, yes. All right. But before I go there, I'm just going to remove the slide for a moment so that you and I can see one another in a slightly larger picture. Michael, welcome. Thank you so much for giving us your time. I appreciate it greatly, and I do hope the listeners and the viewers too. I see that the numbers have grown and are growing this will be recorded and I will post it onto my YouTube channel as well. So thank you again. I trust that it will be fruitful. The main purpose of tonight is to hopefully educate our viewers about the implications of the judgment. So this is not to debate the merits of the case or any such thing. It is to look at the practical implications of the judgment as it was passed down in 2017. So
Sure.
Michael, the director, is that right? That's your title?
I'm the executive director of Freedom of Religion.
Executive director of 4SA, Freedom of Religion South Africa. You were founded in 2014, if I'm correct, and you're an activist organization. Before we start, also very important, although Michael is a lawyer by training, am I right?
Yes, in the UK, and we're not an activist organization. We're a legal advocacy organization.
A legal advocacy organization. Well, I think I'll need some information into exactly what that entails. But you are not a legal consultation firm. You're not registered as a legal practice. It's a legal advocacy organization, also not an activist organization. So let's just make it very clear that we are not giving anybody any legal advice in this conversation. It's a discussion that we hope will be fruitful and supply people with information, especially educators, school principals, governing body members, and parents of school-going children. And as far as children are concerned, it might be insightful to high school learners, especially those maybe serving on student councils and so forth. So, Michael, let's jump in, and I put your slide on, and if you would like to start, I'll give you the floor, and you can start on your slideshow that you graciously prepared for the talk. Thank you so much. There we go.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, and it's really great to be with you tonight. Thanks for the opportunity. As I say, I hope this is going to be interesting. I'm certainly going to try and make it as factual as possible. There may be possibly time for some Q&A afterwards, although I think much of what I'm going to say is going to be pretty self-explanatory. But let me begin by introducing perhaps 4SA, Freedom of Religion South Africa. And as has been mentioned, and Tertia, thank you so much for that. We are a non-profit legal advocacy organization, and we're very narrow in as much as we specifically exist to promote and protect the rights to religious freedom, which are guaranteed by specifically Section 15 of our Constitution. It's worthwhile saying that we are faith neutral. In other words, we stand for all faiths, or for that matter, of people who have no faith at all, because our Constitution, which is the ground upon which we stand, allows every individual the right to choose what and how they believe or not to believe. And secondly, and logically, we are doctrinally neutral. In other words, we don't hold any particular interpretation or preference for any holy text or ideology, but rather we defend the right of each person to make these choices and to believe obviously what they want to believe for themselves. And lastly, and importantly, we're also politically neutral. We work with a broad cross spectrum of political parties and politicians, basically those who we believe can be helpful, or maybe we can help to understand better these rights to religious freedom. So that's essentially where we stand as an organization. And what do we do? Well, we make representations. We particularly make representations to government, to parliament, to Chapter 9 institutions, and as was the case in the matter that we're discussing tonight, the OGOD case, in the courts. We particularly look to educate and empower the religious communities specifically with regard to their legal rights and their responsibilities. And we also try to create awareness regarding any potential or imminent erosions or limitations of religious freedom rights and how best to respond. And of course, we empower people to engage in the process. And hopefully that's part of what we're going to be doing this evening, is to help people to understand what the law regarding religious freedom rights, specifically in the public school sector, entails. And of course, we will sometimes specifically assist people whose rights are under threat. And we build relationships. We work obviously with a lot of the media, with other similar organizations. And in this instance, as I said, in the OGOD case, 4SA provided legal assistance to one of the parties who entered the case as an amicus curiae, or friend of the court. And obviously, the process or the rationale for being a friend of the court is to assist the court by offering our expertise, particularly surrounding religious freedom issues in this case. So, with all that said, and I hope that all makes sense so far, as I'm sure you're aware, and it's probably worthwhile looking a little bit at the background of this case. This case was brought by a secular group called the, and I can only give it to you in English, I'm afraid, although the letters make up the word OGOD in Afrikaans, the Organization for Religious Education and Democracy. And they brought a case against 6 public schools, which openly promoted Christian values and a Christian ethos. And effectively, OGOD were asking the court to do 2 things. The first thing they were asking them to do was to declare illegal, in other words, they could no longer do it, or were not allowed to do it, the law would forbid them to do it, to promote a single faith ethos, or to advise itself of having any particular religious ethos or character. And secondly, and we thought wrongly, to grant an interdict prohibiting 71 Christian practices that were taking place at these schools, ranging from the very generalized to the very specific. And of course, one of the reasons why 4SA got involved is because had OGOD succeeded in those objectives, then instead of freedom of religion being protected in public schools, they would literally have become very similar to the situation which arises in the USA, where there is effectively freedom from religion. In other words, religion and schools are seen as the sort of the state and the faith community, never the twain shall meet in America. And this is a very significant case. It was heard in the High Court of Johannesburg before what is known as a full bench. In other words, there were 3 judges in this instance. And they handed down judgment on the 28th of June 2017. And this judgment was not appealed by any of the parties. So in other words, this judgment is therefore binding on all lower courts, all magistrates' courts, in other words. It is binding upon them as a precedent. And it is obviously binding in Gauteng. It is of persuasive value in the high courts in other provinces, where, of course, most of the 24,000 plus public schools nationwide are located. So even though it wouldn't specifically apply, and this is really just a view in, say, the Western Cape, were a similar case to ever be brought, it would certainly have very persuasive value in the Cape Town, or in the Cape Town High Court, for example. I think most importantly, there are a couple of very important exclusions from this judgment. The first is that it does not apply to private schools. So there are schools which are privately run, privately owned, privately founded, which have a certain religious ethos, and it does not affect those schools whatsoever. So they can continue in exactly that. Nor significantly does it apply to public schools that are built upon land that is owned privately by religious organizations or by denominations, and whose status and religious character is in fact specifically protected by the Schools Act. So there are 2 caveats, therefore, to this judgment. But nevertheless, it's obviously very important, this judgment. And what we're hoping, as you said at the beginning, is so that teachers, learners, parents, school governing bodies, SGBs, and of course, religious practitioners and ministers who work into schools, it's important that all parties understand this judgment and its implications. So I trust, Tertia, and maybe you could just pause me for a second. How is that so far so good? Is everybody on board?
So far, so good. What I was thinking of doing is, this is not a very long, I think there's 12 slides, and I went through it earlier and I made a copy where I made some comments and notes. So at this stage, I think talk us through the last 2 slides or 3 slides, and then I will put up the copy of the document where I've added some questions that we can then dig into the details. As I said, the devil tends to be in the details. So, are you fine with it?
No, absolutely. So let's get into what the judgment actually says, because this is really the nuts and bolts of it. And in considering its judgment, the court considered obviously section 15(2) of the Constitution, which states that religious observances may be conducted at state or state-aided institutions. Obviously, public schools would fall into that category, provided that these observances follow rules made by what the Constitution calls the appropriate public authorities, and that they must be conducted on an equitable basis, and that attendance at them is free and voluntary. And the court in the process also looked at the Provincial Schools Act from each of the 9 provinces. So when it came to the judgment, then importantly, the court did not grant the interdict that OGOD asked for to ban the 71 Christian practices that it had itemized from public schools. Instead, it confirmed the constitutional principle that religious observances, which have a broad meaning, and according to the judgment include things like reading scripture, singing religious songs, prayer times, scripture union activities, religious dress, dietary customs, etc., may take place at public schools. However, all these religious observances are subject to the following 3 conditions. Number 1, they must take place in terms of rules established by the school governing body, which the court held in this judgment are the appropriate public authority. And of course, secondly, observances must take place on an equitable basis. And thirdly, that attendance must be free and voluntary. And it's worthwhile, I think, and what I want to do now is to look at those 3 requirements or elements in a bit more detail to unpack them in terms of the judgment. So, number 1, they must take place in terms of rules established by the school governing body or the SGB. And one of the questions, obviously, as I said, that was answered is what is or who is the appropriate public authority referred to in section 15(2)(a) of the Constitution. And the court declared that that is the school governing body. And it emphasized, and correctly so, we believe, that public schools belong to the community. They do not belong to the state. In the previous apartheid era, of course, we had state schools. In other words, the state basically decided everything that happened in the schools, the context of the schools, the curriculum, the content of the curriculum. They were basically, if you like, state assets. Well, now they're considered to be community owned in that sense. And therefore, appropriately, the responsibility is for the community to take ownership of the school through the representation of the school governing body. And therefore, a public school which does not obviously have rules currently concerning the conduct of religious observances should establish such rules. That was a very central element to this judgment. And of course, this should ideally happen through a process of consultation. It's a type of family discussion, if you like, where the school's parents and other parties of the school governing bodies decide and define what they believe, particularly the parents, by the way, particularly parents of younger children, is needed for their children to practice and express their religious beliefs freely in the school environment. And of course, this process must take into account, very importantly, the fact that South Africa is a diverse society where the people, including, of course, every school learner, can hold to different religious beliefs. And as such, therefore, these rules may have to be revised from time to time because it's dynamic. So in as much as the composition of the school in terms of those who attend it, and particularly their faith, changes, then obviously the schools may the school governing body may need to revise these and review them from time to time. And the OGOD judgment suggests, of course, that in addition to the observances that take place on an equitable basis and are free and voluntary, they should also cover a situation where religious practitioners or organizations work into the school. So it's important that is also a consideration in these rules. And again, it should be emphasized that therefore that if the school governing body so decides, there is therefore nothing to prevent religious practitioners or ministries to work with and assist the school. And in many cases, in many schools, this is welcomed by both the school and the parents. But again, it's up to the school governing body to make those rules or to establish that policy. So that's the first element, the school governing body's role. Then secondly, they must take place on an equitable basis. In other words, the school must act even-handedly, it must act fairly in relation to learners of different religions, or for that matter, no religion at all, and take into account that, as I said, we live in a diverse society where there should be space for all to practice their religious beliefs, and including, of course, in the context of public school. And this is, as I said, going to vary from school to school, and even potentially within the same school from time to time. Obviously, the considerations would be the learner body makeup, the need of the school, something that obviously the SGB will be working at a grassroots level. So maybe just by way of example, if let's say a school in 2022 has a learner body makeup of say 75% people from the Islamic faith and 15% Christian faith, 10% Jewish faith, then obviously its religious policies can look very different from a school that is made up of 95% Christian learners. What is important, and the principle, is that each learner must feel that they are free to enjoy their right to religious freedom. It's important, I think, when we're talking about the equitable basis, specifically the judgment does not oblige schools, public schools we're talking about, of course, to conduct multi-faith observances. For example, they don't have to read in one session or on a rotational basis certain religious texts in a school assembly, or pray a universal prayer, or have a moment of silence. That is not the requirement. It's not like equal in that sense, it's equitable. And that brings us to the third element, which is that attendance must be free and voluntary, which of course means that every learner has a choice as to whether or not to attend a religious observance. And obviously it's advisable that this is clearly and continuously communicated to learners, that they do have this choice. And learners specifically should not feel under any obligation or pressure to attend religious observances. And even particularly, I think, where you have children of different faith in a public school context, a practical example would be in, let's say, a school where 95% of the learners are Christians and or the Christian faith, and the school decides to allow these learners to express that faith, and they say scripture readings at the start of the school assembly or what have you, then the school obviously should also allow the minority Muslim learners that time slot, during that time slot, to stay away, say, for the first part of an assembly, rather than to have them sort of come in and then have to leave and then return, and then obviously they could use that time slot for their own religious practices or reading. It should never be a situation whereby, for example, a child might, or a learner might feel somehow uncomfortable by being told, okay, we're about to have the scripture reading, so you children of the Islamic faith, and now you can leave. It should never be something like that. That pressure should not be indirect in that sense. And again, the court did not find that it was illegal, by the way, and this is also quite significant, for schools to request learners to state, for purposes obviously of ensuring this equitable treatment and free and voluntary attendance, what particular religion they are associated with, if any. So schools can ask that question. And again, following on from the logic that public schools belong to the community and the makeup and faith of this community could change over time, the school ruled in its judgment that it is illegal, and therefore this is another essential and important element of this judgment, for a public school to promote or to allow its staff to promote that it as a public school adheres to only one, or predominantly only one religion to the exclusion of others, or that it holds out that it promotes the interests of one religion in favor of others. So there are a couple of implications to this. The first being that obviously if a school has been promoting a single religious ethos, it should then take steps to reverse this, both externally and internally. And that may involve making some revisions. It could mean it has to revive its prospectus or its website. It might need to amend its letterheads. For example, it could even have implications for, say, the school badge or the school motto, or even potentially the school anthem. And of course, it does mean that teachers should not also promote their personal religious views to the exclusions of all others in the school content. I think it's probably worthwhile saying, by the way, that our religious studies in schools do not teach and should not sort of teach or proselytize that is something that is also not part of this judgment, but that is also just a general rule. So what does this mean from a practical point of view? Well, obviously, if the school doesn't have a religious policy, it needs to make sure that it develops one. And typically that's going to be through a process of consultation, and that process will be driven by the school governing body. And the idea is that it will take into account that South Africa is a diverse society where all people, obviously including learners, hold different religious beliefs. And just on a practical level, if a school doesn't know how to do this or needs advice to do this, then there is the Federation of Governing Bodies for South Africa, known as FEDSAS, or even 4SA, who can certainly point you in the right direction. Now, once the school has developed the policy, it should ensure that everyone concerned knows how the policy works, because obviously the whole purpose of this judgment is to bring clarity. And that would mean that there would need to be some form of educational informative process for teachers, excuse me, for learners, and especially for parents who enroll their children in the school. And there ought to, by the way, also be a process for handling complaints from a parent or child, because obviously if there are issues or disputes arising, it's best to work them out within the context of an agreed framework. And again, these rules, as I said, may need to be revised from time to time to ensure that they remain suitable for the learner makeup of the school. Now, again, in terms of a time frame, the court didn't make any prescription, but there is certainly the expectation that schools will begin this process to make sure that they are compliant with it. And I think importantly, though, in that context, school governing bodies should certainly not be bullied or be subjected to undue pressure by external or internal groups to make drastic changes in haste, because that's also not going to be helpful. So just to summarize then, a single faith branding or ethos is no longer permitted for a public school. And yet, that said, of course, religious observances may continue to form a vibrant part of school life. And secularism is certainly not the policy for public schools in South Africa. And unlike in the USA, we are therefore free to enjoy, or learners are free to enjoy, freedom of religion in schools, not freedom from religion. So I hope this has been helpful. And certainly, as I said, this isn't intended to be legal advice. You should, if you want that, specifically seek that for yourself. But I trust that it has given a good overview and a framework. And certainly that's what we 4SA try to do. And if you would like more information, and you'll find it, in fact, on our website, www.forsa.org.za, you're more than welcome to visit there and to do your own research yourself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Now, let's. I'm going to remove that slide, and I'm going to go to the question. So you'll see that I took your document exactly as it was, and I just added my questions. So the first thing that I would like to discuss is the whole idea of voluntary attendance of religious observances. So what is currently happening in most of the public schools in the country is that, firstly, and that's something I found very interesting about your presentation, I have never come across a school informing learners or parents that attendance of religious observances is that they have a choice. The way it has never ever been communicated. And I'd just like to add here that it should also be communicated to educators. So I worked in the school environment all my life, and even in the past 4 years, it has never ever been communicated that it is voluntary to attend religious observances. Religious observances are part and parcel of the day, sometimes several times a day. In some schools, there's actually a bell that goes, and you have to do the religious observances. So that's the first educational aspect that I would just like school governors, school principals, educators, and even the Department of Education to take note of. That is no longer, well, the way I see it, it shouldn't be that if the members of staff have to be at school at 7:15, then that's when the day's work should start. It should be the case that you get there at 7:15, and then there's religious observance, and then for anything from 5 to 10, 15 minutes, and thereafter the business of the day starts. Because I see that as in line, that is voluntary attendance. If those who would like to do religious observances, they can start at 7:00, and they can, but everybody knows at 7:15 the business of the day starts. What is your opinion on that?
Well, as I said, the opinion on that is basically what this judgment said, which is that there's the school governing body that's going to establish the policy for the school. And that would obviously, I would imagine, entail things like, when are these religious observances going to happen? How do they happen? And as I mentioned, obviously, the free and voluntary elements of it, very important. An information or an educational dimension of it, so that learners particularly, I think, but all members of staff as well, understand their religious freedom rights. Your religious freedom rights is, as I said, includes not being compelled to attend, if that's what you so choose. But at the same time, there would be nothing, depending upon the makeup of the school and the learner composition and the faith composition specifically of those learners, and obviously their parents to a measure. Then yes, I mean, even some of the examples that you gave wouldn't be problematic. Like observances at more than one time during the course of the day. If that's the ethos of the school, so to speak, that the school governing body have decided as a policy in terms of what they will allow, then as long as there is free and voluntary attendance and it's on an equitable basis, then there's no problem with the actual practices that you mentioned. But it must be within the framework, therefore, of this judgment.
I think that one of the reasons schools are not adhering to the judgment, because in my opinion, most schools aren't, the very first reason I give for making that statement is that learners in particular are not informed that they have a choice, nor are educators. It is just assumed that everybody will attend. And when I just want to make a remark. I do talk about that later on. The idea that the composition of the school is important here. To what extent are the rights of religious minorities, or should the rights of religious minorities be addressed? Because let's say, for example, the school is 95% Christian in terms of educators, learners, parents, and so forth. So obviously, if it's voluntary, then it shouldn't be a problem. But the fact is, it's in practice, it's quite difficult to make it voluntary. And I think that's one of the reasons why schools are not adhering to what the judgment actually requires. Because in practice, if you think of a school of 1,000 learners and you have assembly, so now the first 10, 15, 20 minutes of the assembly is the religious observance part. So now you have 100 learners who are not part of that part of the assembly. So they have to be accommodated somewhere else. You have to literally split up your assembly and say, all right, now the religious observance is finished. Right, let's wait for the 100 who are not religious or don't adhere to the Christian faith. Let's wait for them to enter. So I think that is why it causes a problem. And but in my opinion, schools have to adhere to that rule and change their way of doing it. But having said that, the other problem that scenario creates. And if you look at the section 27 booklet, that's not very clear. No, that's not going to work. Is the moment you have learners being separated, do you not think that creates a feeling of separation and possible ostracization? How would you advise schools to deal with that?
Well, as I said, the whole element that we discussed about it being something which shouldn't be in any way it could compel. I also did mention specifically the idea of making sure that there isn't a sort of almost an indirect ostracization, or in other words, if you're in the school assembly and you have finished a certain element of, and then it's like, well, that group there and that group there, you may leave because now we're going to read scripture or something like that, then clearly you're almost putting an indirect pressure on people and on those learners, and that is not the point. Look, obviously there are practical issues, but again, these are the things that should be thrashed through by school governing bodies as part of their consultation process. How is this going to work? I mean, I'm not here at all to tell people what they should and should not do. What I'm trying to just unpack for you and for those who are listening to this is what the principles are. And the principle is that, number one, yes, you can have religious observances taking place in school assemblies. They can have scriptures and they can sing songs or hymns or whatever they want to do. But you need to effectively reasonably accommodate people of other faiths, and that should be part of the policy. So yes, that might mean that people have to sit out for a certain part of the religious observances, say, aspect, but come back for maybe the announcements about some sporting events or whatever it might happen to be that takes place. It's a long time since I was in a school assembly. The idea is to make sure that religious rights are sensitively, shall we say, accommodated, in as much as learners should not feel pressured directly or indirectly to participate.
So something else that I think might be addressed as well, and I know it might be and it probably is a little bit nitpicky, but so often in these matters, the devil really is in the details, because religious observance is allowed very clearly. We are not a secular state. Religious instruction is not. Now, in my experience, talking to parents, having had children in school, having been a staff member, in practice, once again, the difference between religious observances and religious instruction, how would you, in real practical terms, speak to that?
Well, obviously, as part of the school curriculum itself, or the content that is taught in the school curriculum, you cannot use that to proselytize. So, for example, you cannot use it to declare that one particular faith is the right faith or the best faith or whatever that may happen to be. And teachers in that context should not obviously be doing that. However, that said, when we're talking about, assemblies and the like, we're talking about things that are, if you like, external to the actual content of what is taught in the school, albeit that it forms part of the life of the school. And I think there is a distinction. So for example, if the school is predominantly made up of people of one particular faith, and it doesn't obviously, and in many areas it isn't a Christian faith grouping. It could be an Islamic faith grouping, or in Durban, perhaps a sort of Hindu faith grouping. Then, yes, they obviously should be allowed to celebrate that and to live it out. And that is the whole thing about religious freedom. It's supposed to be, and our Constitution has said that it is not something that you must be sort of muzzled. You don't have to check your faith in when you step out of your house in the morning. It's very much been declared to be an integral and essential part of human dignity. And therefore, to share it, to live it out, to express it, to believe it. This is a constitutional right that obviously attaches to every individual. And that would obviously be learners specifically in the school context, but also teachers for that matter. So a teacher, obviously I'm not talking about in a classroom context, but I'm talking about, say, a teacher who is asked about their faith by a pupil. They are, unlike in America, entitled, sure to share their faith if that's what they're asked to do. And obviously, if it is free and voluntary, they can't sit the people down and say, now I'm going to tell you about, my belief. No, but it is the context of the school is a context within which religious observances and even the celebration of faith is obviously permitted. But as I say, with the obvious caveat of that it isn't something that you can teach sort of specifically within the context of this is the right way or this is the wrong way or what have you.
So if a primary school, a public primary school, in a grade junior phase, they have Bible lesson every Friday, and the writing and speaking activity is based on that Bible lesson. Does that count as religious instruction or religious observance?
Well, I mean, for example, one of the things that is certainly allowed is, say, for example, the inviting of the school. If and again, let's go back to the essence of this judgment. This policy is developed and agreed by the school governing body. So there isn't a sort of a right way and a wrong way there. It is what does the school governing body, which is obviously the representative body, what have they decided has been the right approach, so to speak, for that particular school to represent the faith of the learners in that school. So it isn't necessarily a right or a wrong way.
Okay, so I want to make this clear. So if I understand your interpretation correctly, then if the school governing body decides that we are a Christian school and that we will have in our academic contact time, every Friday there's a Bible lesson, and the school governing body decides that, then that's just the way it is. It's fine.
If it is within school time and it is part of, if you like, a lesson of instruction as part of the school curriculum, then I don't believe that is allowed. However,
well, that's the scenario. That's exactly the scenario that I'm talking about. And in fact, Hermanus Primary School is doing exactly that. And when I had a meeting with the teacher and the HOD, they said, well, they are a Christian school. They're a public school. They're not on government. They are full on public school. And they have religious instruction. So there's every Friday, there's a Bible lesson. And then the academic work for that day is centered around the Bible lesson. The children are taught prayers in class, and they are just of the opinion that that's what the governing body decided, and that's what they should. That's their right to do that. Now, my opinion is that's not in line with the court judgment. Well, never mind the court judgment. In my opinion, that's against the Schools Act, even before the judgment. So you were going. So that's exactly the scenario that I'm talking about. And to make it worse, when a parent asked, she said, "Well, I'm not religious, and I don't want my son to be taught religion." She was told, well, then this little grade 1 child can sit outside for the duration of that lesson. Those are the types of things that are happening in public schools in South Africa on a daily basis. And I think that is the type of education that Christian educators, especially, because what I've seen is that I don't want to use the word perpetrators because it may sound harsh, but it is most often Christians that do this. In fact, at the Hermanus Primary School, the teacher said, well, I'm a Christian teacher. I have to teach the Bible. I have to pray in class with the children because as a Christian, I have to do that. So the problem with that is as a professional person, you have a particular stature. And to a certain extent, as an educator, you have to divorce yourself from your faith when you are standing in front of a class of students. And I don't see that happening. And I think one of the reasons is because people have this, and I've been told this numerous times, they say, well, the majority of the parents and the staff and the learners are Christian. So why can't we do this?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, you as a teacher, you have a specific role in the role that you play in the classroom, obviously. And as you correctly stated, the Schools Act does govern exactly what and how teaching should take place in schools. And schools specifically are not places for, let's say, ideological instruction. I mean, that was one of the big issues with the apartheid school system, was that effectively, they were used as vehicles to teach an ideological viewpoint, a worldview, so to speak. And that is definitely one of the big changes that took place of post-1994 and is reflected in our law. What we're talking about here in terms of what happens in public schools, and I must again emphasize, in public schools are obviously different contexts, as are, as I mentioned, schools that are built on ground or land that's owned by religious organizations or what have you. But in that context, teaching it in the classroom setting as part of the curriculum, as part of the content, that would, in my understanding, and as I say, I'm not expressing a legal viewpoint here, but in my understanding, would be going beyond what the authorization of a teacher is. However, as I said, if, for example, a different scenario, that the school invited in, say, the Scripture Union, and the Scripture Union ran, classes or whatever it might happen to be for children after school, in a break time, in the lunch hour, whatever it might happen to be, and children who wanted to or whatever went and attended those, then well and good. That's the expression of your faith in the context of the public school. So there is definitely a distinction between what is sort of free and voluntary and as almost external to the teaching dynamic of the school. The OGOD case did not deal with the teaching of content or curriculum in the school. It dealt specifically with religious observances within the school context as a whole.
And something that maybe to make it practical for educators and parents listening, especially educators, and especially, well, it goes for, I identify as secular humanist. So the same rule applies to me. When I stand in front of a class, I can say, I do not believe that there is a God. To me, that is a neutral statement because I'm expressing my belief. But I would not permit myself to stand in front of a class and say, there is no God. And to me, that is the difference between religious observance and religious instruction. And it may seem very technical, but it makes a huge difference, So a teacher who says, I believe that Jesus lives in my heart, and a teacher who says, Jesus lives in your heart. To me, the first one, I believe that Jesus lives in my heart, that is religious observance. But to say to a 7-year-old, remember, Jesus lives in your heart, to me, that is religious instruction. And I think teachers should refrain from doing that, in particular in the classroom, as part of their activities with learners. And I'm hoping that this is the educational task that I've taken upon myself to show the difference and just it may seem like a very small difference, but it actually makes a big, it has a huge impact. Okay, so
Yeah,
let me.
I think what you basically are saying essentially is that one is a teacher sharing, say, a personal testimony, and another is actually telling people this is what you must do to celebrate faith correctly, for example.
Exactly.
And there is a big distinction between the two, obviously.
And it's a lot about sensitizing educators in particular. Okay, am I looking? Okay, there we go. There's my other. I'm just looking at my comments there. Okay, I think we've addressed this. What I asked here, I said. So if the SGB decides.
The mercy.
Well, that's what it sometimes feels like. I'll tell you. You know, I have so many examples of educators and school governing bodies, in my opinion, infringing upon the right of freedom of religion of especially minorities. For example, just last week at a high school just around the corner from me, the Gideons handed out Bibles to all the grade 8. Now, I know that this happened in school time. This was class time. All the grade 8s were ushered into the hall, and they were Bibles were handed out to them. And that happens as a routine in many schools, and it's seen as accepted behavior. Several tens of schools, no, probably hundreds of schools, still have on their school website, "We are a Christian ethos school." And the religious policies are looked at quite a few, and most of them do not reflect the changes of the judgment. In particular, the aspect about voluntary attendance. In fact, just when I was a substitute teacher at a high school in 2016, and I heard a learner ask the teacher to be exempted from assembly. This was a high school. And the teacher said, "You're not a Muslim, are you?" And the girl said, "No, I'm not a Muslim, but I'm also not a Christian. I'm not religious." And this was a grade 9 girl. And the teacher looked at her and said, "Get back in line. What's this nonsense with you? Get back in line and go into the hall, you know." And that, regrettably, is the attitude that is still dominant in many cases. I have evidential proof of educators in classrooms telling children that when they feel depressed, it's because demons are fighting over their soul in the spiritual realm. You know, those are the types of things that parents and learners are experiencing on a daily basis, because there is so little education that's being done about not the tolerance of our religious diversity, but the celebration and the normalization of the growing population of non-believers. So, yeah, I don't know if you want to say anything about this. I think we've addressed this issue about being at the mercy of the governing body and what exactly the governing body's role is. So,
yeah, I think it is important to say that, you know, again, we have to distinguish what happens in the classroom during school educational instructional time and what happens externally within the school context itself. That's a very important distinction to make. And the question about, are you at the mercy of the school governing bodies? Well, in a sense, yes, but that school governing body is supposedly representative of the broader community of the school, in other words, its composition. More specifically, and this was also clear in the judgment, that when the policy is drawn up, it is something that should be done on a consultative basis. I mean, for example, one of the reasons why schools are allowed, I believe, to ask for the religious affiliation of learners is to help it formulate a policy that will be fair and reflective of the, let's say, the religious composition of the school. But it should definitely be done on a consultative basis. So, you know, it wouldn't be for example, acceptable for, and it would probably be challengeable, is let's say there are a group of parents who are, very committed atheists, for example, and they have effectively become the exclusive members of the school governing body, but actually 95% of the rest of the children in the school are of another faith, so it's an Islamic faith. For that school governing body to then say, no, we're not going to have any religious observances in school, that wouldn't be acceptable, because you're not, again, engaging with and representing the context of the school. So it is very important. As I said in my presentation, education of learners, of teachers, of parents. This policy should be widely consulted upon and, of course, widely disseminated. People should understand it. They should understand what their expectations are, what their rights are. And, of course, as I said, there should be some form of complaint procedure so that things can be dealt with if there are conflicts arising for whatever reason. Then they can be amicably resolved and dealt with.
Yes, I agree, though in my experience, school governing bodies are quite insular little groups of people. I mean, I served on a couple myself. So regrettably, most parents are they're not really interested in serving on governing bodies. And I must say that it's quite difficult to get something like this to be consultative. So in practice, it really doesn't happen. And perhaps that's why conversations like these are important, because if you want to have your child or yourself as a member of staff, for example, if you want your rights to be exercised or respected, then you should participate. And I know many parents tell me that they're afraid to reveal that they're not religious because they're afraid of victimization and discrimination, which does happen in sort of subtle ways. But I also think that one should have the courage of one's convictions and say, I think this should have, please, can we talk about this and see what we can do to make things more equitable? Something that I did find interesting talking about the word equitable is that equitable does not mean equal. So I did find that that is something that one needs to consider. So I just want to look at my next. Okay, there we go. Now, that is now really getting into the detail. How should religious observances be done? And, that's one of the things where it's easy to say that religious observances shouldn't, well, I don't know, should religious observance be conducted as part of the school day? So, because if you think practically now, a high school starts at 7:30. Then you have sort of a 20-minute or so, normally they call it register or homeroom or something like that. And then there's the lessons, say 4, and then a break, and then another 3, and then maybe another break. So what does academic time constitute? And in my opinion, that's the moment the school bell rings. And then non-academic time would be break times and then after school. So where does religious observance fit into the school day on a very practical level now?
I'm not really qualified to answer that question because it's been an awful long time since I was at school. But the principle of the judgment, and I think we need to just go back to that. The OGOD petition was that 71 Christian practices, and they literally ranged from reading of scriptures to singing of hymns to religious dress to all. They wanted everything basically excluded from the public school ambit, so to speak. And the court did not grant that interdict. So, for example, religious observances has been given a very broad meaning. Yes, it can involve the reading of scripture or from the Quran or whatever holy text that might be, or singing religious songs. having prayer times, moments of prayer, scripture union. Religious dress is a very important thing. Dietary customs. You know, there was a constitutional court case in KZN where a young Hindu learner in the Pillay case had a nose stud,
nose ring.
Of a almost like a coming of age type ceremony, and the school had a jewelry policy, and they said no, you can't wear that. And the principle was that no, she absolutely could wear that, and that it should be reasonably accommodated. Because again, we're talking about a public school context, not a private school context.
Not a public, yes, absolutely.
And so yes, things like religious dress also needs to be accommodated, and we've had other cases. We've had other cases, for example, you know, where remember the army major who wanted to wear a particular head covering with the Hindu faith, and again, the military were told, no, you have to reasonably accommodate that. So there must be reasonable accommodation. And again, specifically, what does that look like in practice? Well, and I have to keep banging this drum, that's for the school governing body to work out. What does that look like? When will these take place? What will be what's okay and maybe what's not okay? It is very much going to vary from school to school. There, particularly in the judgment, was not an emphasis of some sort of like cookie cutter, you know, you could only do it from X to Y time and only in this. No, that's now left very much in the hands of the school governing body to develop that. And you may be correct that, you know, school governing bodies, maybe they are not very easy to access or what have you, but bearing in mind that there is an obligation for schools now to develop, or the school governing bodies to develop a religious policy for the school. So it is something which schools should be actively engaged in, school governing bodies should be actively engaged in. And that might be a good place to start the conversation. Because again, it's going to be typically a question of hearing all parties, hearing the concerns, hearing and making sure that within the framework of the OGOD judgment specifically, that a religious policy is ultimately developed. But it's going to be unique, school to school, going to be different.
Yes, and then I do know that the lines between the ambit of the school governing body and the education department, those lines are not always very clearly delineated. For example, in a case where the Gideons are coming to the school to hand out Bibles, obviously this was done during academic contact time. So and neither, I don't think you or I are equipped at this moment to say, does that fall within the ambit of the school governing body to decide how much of academic contact time is going to be devoted, or if any at all, to religious observances? However, I do think that it is fair to say that a school may not give any academic time to religious instruction. And I'm talking about.
It would depend. I mean, for example, again, if the school has a policy, if the school wanted to invite the Gideon group in to a school assembly, and they were able to share whatever it is they share and to hand out the Bibles, which is obviously what they do. If the school governing body is happy with that as part of their policy to invite such groups in, and they make sure that people aren't compelled to be there or to be forced to take a Bible or to be sort of shamed if they say no. You know, again, we're talking, all this is within the parameters of this judgment.
I think I will need to have a discussion with an official of the Department of Education, because I can't see the governing body, obviously, something like a school assembly, that's something else. But I can't see the school governing body having the power to say, well, we want Gideons to come into our school every day from 10 till 12 and do religious instruction. Surely that to me, that just doesn't sound as if it should be allowed in a public school that has the purpose of educating learners. And then the governing body says, well, we would like to have religious instruction in our school because that's our policy, and we're going. Surely, what the governing body decides has to be in accordance with the Schools Act and so forth. I mean, they can't just decide that they want to have religious instruction in school time,
No,
even if it is voluntary.
We've already established that that's the case.
Yeah, but I think that needs to be made quite clear. So yes, the last thing that I would perhaps like you to speak about is what I've experienced in my conversations with school governing bodies and so forth, is that and educators, that they are very clear that they have to respect other people's religion. And once again, I've had mostly contact with Christians at public schools, and this idea that we know we have to respect people of no faith and other religions, but I think something is missing there. To respect something can often mean to tolerate it. And the ambit of our Constitution is about celebrating our diversity, not just respecting it. So, for example, I run the nonprofit that I run. We do critical thinking skills training and media literacy, but we are also a secular humanist organization. And I find it almost impossible to get access to a school to talk to the learners about critical thinking skills. Whereas if you go to a school and you say, I'm a Christian organization and I want to, so if you say I'm a Christian organization and I want to talk about drug abuse, then you are given as much access as you want. But if you say I'm a secular humanist organization and I talk about drugs within the context of critical thinking skills, it's almost impossible to get access. You are just given a cold shoulder. And I think within the OGOD judgment, I think that's one of the reasons why OGOD started the whole process, is because of that resistance and the lack of celebrating the diversity and being equitable. We're not expecting, it doesn't have to be equal. It's not as if for every Christian assembly there has to be a Jewish and a Muslim and a secular one. I perfectly get that. But what do you think can we do to educate educators and school governing bodies that it's not a threat to have a secular organization address the learners? Because the distinct impression that I get is they find it extremely threatening. As if I do a presentation about critical thinking skills or secular humanism or skepticism, as if all the learners are then going to become atheists overnight, which just won't happen, you know.
Well, again, back to the judgment. The school governing body is going to set the policy, and that policy has certain parameters and certain issues, and equitability is one, the free and fair attendance is another, and does that give any organization or any particular, let's say, world viewpoint the right to basically be heard in that specific school? I would say the answer is probably no, because it's going to, not the right, certainly the opportunity, but not the right necessarily. So
don't you think? So couldn't I argue that it's equitable for a school governing body to limit who they decide may have access to the school?
Yeah, well, they're obviously going to be. I mean, the very nature of the policy is that it's going to be putting in some parameters and therefore some limitations. That's the nature of it. It's supposed to represent the learner body of the school, the views of the parents, particularly the younger children, the children themselves, the teachers, and what have you. And obviously, in so doing, it's going to have some limitations for some, and it's going to open up some opportunities for others. and it's going to be on a school by school, case by case basis. So,
sorry. So if the school principal, this is quite a complicated issue, because the power, it seems to me that the real debate here is what are the powers of the school governing body and what are the powers of the Department of Education. And according to the judge, so what's being said, according to the way you interpret the judgment, is that the power rests with the school governing body, and as long as they so they decide what is equitable. So if they decide it's equitable to have only Christian pastors admitted to the school, then that's equitable. If they decide that and
yes,
it's
the answer to that question is that the judgment specifically, when it looked at the Constitution and in the context of the schools in this instance, Section 15.2a, it rules that the appropriate public authority, who are empowered to make the rules or the policies within which religious observances can be carried out in a public school context, is the school governing body.
The school governing body.
All roads will therefore lead you to the school governing body. They are the ones that have the authority in this instance. That's what the court's decided. And obviously there are school governing body representatives at a sort of more structural level. FEDSAS, I know, is very, very good at this. We have had many discussions with them over time about multiple areas involving sort of schools and so on. And that is really where I think school governing bodies should be pointed to help them to understand the implications of the judgment specifically, and also to get some help as to, what would that process look like, perhaps what would a policy development process look like, so that it is within the parameters of this OGOD judgment. Because that is, as I say, really where we stand. And look, some people won't necessarily be happy with it, for whatever different reasons, but that is now effectively what the court has decided. As I say, interestingly enough, it is binding on magistrates' courts nationally. It is of persuasive value outside of the Gauteng area, but because it was a full bench decided by 3 judges, and because it was a very well-reasoned judgment, and because it was not appealed by any of the parties, and if people hadn't been generally happy with it, it certainly would have been appealed, and it wasn't. That is now likely to be something which, if you were to bring a case, for example, on a similar basis in another province, almost certainly the High Court judge would look to that particular case and probably then just replicate it.
So if I want to complain about my grade 1 child being taught prayers in class and being given instruction in the Christian faith, I should complain to the governing body, in other words.
I wouldn't be able to tell you who to complain to. As I say, again, let's understand, we're talking about separate contexts. We're talking about the context where the actual educational teaching of the CAPS curriculum in that time frame, that's a different matter when it comes to religious instruction, which shouldn't take place there, versus religious observances, which will happen within the school context, within obviously school time in the broadest sense.
But can you see how? Okay, it's not your problem, obviously, and I don't think you'll have the answer now. But it's so easy to say, yeah, but the one is about what happens in the classroom, and that's and the other one is religious observances at the school. But where do you draw the line between those two events? And I think in that case, as regards that, the judgment is actually very muddies the waters, in my opinion, because and the way that you see it is also the governing body has the power, and the governing body decides what happens in the school. But
based upon its discussions with and the development of a policy with the overall, let's call family. It should be like a family discussion in that sense. That's I think, I'm not even sure that wasn't maybe a phrase in the judgment, but it should be something that everybody sits down together and talks it out so that a consensus is reached, obviously.
It is reached, yeah.
That's the ideal. And there may be exceptions. There may still be people who won't be happy with the outcome, but that's just, unfortunately, the way that this judgment is. It's never going to be perfect for everybody. I think that's fairly clear. I don't think society ends up with everybody being perfectly happy with everything.
Yeah, it's what I do think is important though, and I'm hoping as a secular individual, I'm hoping that this message will at least go out loud and clear, that educators and learners should be informed that they have a choice about whether or not to attend religious observances. There should not be religious instruction in classrooms. If that happens, it should be without and outside of the contact time. And then that I'm still not 100% clear about who to address issues to. So
a couple of other things that might be worth mentioning is that a public school cannot hold itself out to have a particular religious affiliation. So you cannot have the sort of the Weinberg Christians Boys High School, for example. And again, things like, for example, let's suppose that you have a badge on your blazer that says sort of, Jesus is Lord, for example. I mean, that is, again, not something which, as a public school, you could actually have that as
well, what about having a sign outside the school that says God bless?
It's very generic.
Sorry?
It's very generic. I mean, what does that mean exactly? So, it probably isn't something that, on the other hand, don't forget, it has been very clearly stated that public schools are not like godless environments. You're allowed to celebrate your faith within the public school. And so, therefore, to have a sign on saying God bless, I don't think that, even though if you're a committed atheist, that might be offensive, or you might think that's not true, or whatever.
That is perhaps something that I could get somebody in to talk about, the whole issue of offense and what offends and why it offends. And
what is the place of offense? And again, we can very much have a discussion at some later point about, say, freedom of speech, for example.
Just something that I found interesting in one of the conversations I had, and that is at a deeper level. That's not so much to do with the judgment, but I always wonder why religious observances are so important. Why do people feel, why do governing bodies, why do educators feel that there has to be religious observances where all the children should attend? What is the purpose of that? And I'm talking now as an educator. In my experience, it's not to celebrate the belief. In my experience, those assemblies and those religious observances are to preach. It is to tell the children, you have to make the right choices. And that's why I was quite harping on the difference between religious observance and religious instruction. That is something, to me, that is actually where the little devil is in the detail. Because every single school assembly that I've attended in my life as a learner, well, that doesn't count because that was before 1990. So that's Christian national education. But since 1996, when I started teaching, up to 2 years ago when I attended school assemblies, it's not a celebration of what we believe. It's indoctrination. It is, to have sports events opened with prayer, to have Bible reading, and to have pastors. I've never heard a celebration of what people believe. All I've ever heard is instruction. This is what you should believe. This is what you must do to get to heaven. This is what if you do this, you will go to hell. And to me, that is a little bit problematic, because I don't think people understand the distinction between religious observance and religious instruction. But yeah, I don't know. You're welcome to.
Well, bear in mind, I mean, again, back to the school governing body. The question is, who are the parents of the school? What is their faith composition? Because obviously, when you commit your child into an educational system, which is why we have a very different school system than we did under the apartheid era, is you're not handing them over and just into some sort of indoctrination environment. But however, you as a parent can expect, and the school policy itself says that schools should actually assist parents in that sense, to make sure that their values and their beliefs are also involved in the school context. And we're not talking about the educational context, but we're talking about within the environment of the school. And as a parent, you obviously would expect your faith, ethos, whatever it is that you're teaching your children, to certainly not be contradicted when they go to school. And that's why, as I say, there is this, you must be reasonably accommodating. It must be fair and equitable. It must not be in any way sort of like forced or coerced. And as a parent, if you're teaching your child, whatever faith it is, you should be able to know that is going to be potentially upheld in the environment of the school system, for want of a better word. And again, that's not what the school governing body is supposed to do. It's supposed to be speaking with the parents and speaking with parents who have faith or who want their children to believe something completely different.
But then it feels. You see, it feels to me then that I am, especially as a parent of a minority worldview, I'm at the mercy of the governing body, and I don't think that that's right. So, firstly, my child now has to be excused, so he's singled out. He stands out, which my kids just went through the assemblies, and then. I know I'm in the minority, but why should I, as the minority, have to submit to the will of the governing body? Because the governing body decides that they want to have religious instruction, not religious observance. And as I say, what happens in practice is things like, I don't know if you see the comment on the screen, put up your hand if you want to give your heart to Jesus. Altar calls happening during school assemblies. And I don't think it's fair to say, well, if the governing body decides that that's what they want at that school, then sorry, but that's just the way it is. I don't think the judgment had that intention. But for example, I was at a parents' meeting where these things were discussed, and I said, well, I'm non-religious. And one of the parents said to me, well, why do you put your child in a Christian school if you're non-religious? Find yourself another school. And I think that brings us to the heart of the matter, that is the attitude. And the attitude of the school governing body. And so I find that problematic, that the school governing body has so much power. So, 80% of our parents are Christian. So we're a Christian school and we will have religious instruction, regardless of what the Constitution says. And the attitude in particular is you literally feel as if you're at the mercy of the governing body. And to make it even more difficult, when you work with children and with young children in particular, it's such a sensitive issue. And I think that was. So maybe I did speak to Timothy Fish Hodgson. He was one of the co-authors of the school religious policy handbook of section 27. And I think that one of the main reasons that the interdict wasn't granted is that it was on procedural grounds. So I think we need another court case because the real issue wasn't tested, in my opinion. I don't know who's going to drive that one.
Well, again, that's always every citizen's right. Is if you're not happy with something and you ultimately believe that it is sufficiently egregious that you want to take it to court, then that's entirely your right. And yes, I mean, obviously, again, this is only a high court ruling, and it is possible, therefore, that another case can be brought, a similar case, maybe slightly different sets of facts, but the judges or the judge can review it. And again, if people aren't happy with the decision there's the opportunity potentially to appeal it to the Supreme Court of Appeal and ultimately to the Constitutional Court. And so that is, if you like, the openness that there is if people feel sufficiently strongly that they want to actually take this and challenge it under obviously a different set of facts, probably, or certainly from a different angle. Right? If you come with the same set of facts, you're going to get the same decision. So it would need, I think, to be something very specific or something that's particularly been, and again, obviously making sure that you're bringing whatever case it is under the right aspect. So, for example, if something's happening that's a breach of the Schools Act, that would be different from something which is actually non-compliant with the OGOD judgment, for example. So it's obviously that with legal matters often turn on very fine nuances, as you are probably aware.
Absolutely. So I don't see any questions from audience members. Michael, let's confirm for the educators and the school governing body chairpersons out there. According to the judgment, you are not allowed to brand yourself as a Christian ethos school. And I would also advise governing bodies to make it clear to the educators and the principals that learners, especially in high schools, educators should be informed that they have a choice whether or not to attend. And they don't have to give a reason for not wanting to attend. They can be asked for a reason, but they don't have to declare. So because, for example, I know of cases where the child had deconverted. So we're talking mostly high school. So you have a grade 10 child who's deconverted. His parents doesn't know. He doesn't want his parents or anybody else to know. And he cannot be forced to say why he doesn't want to attend. And then for those non-religious parents, I will do some homework because I'm not 100% clear on the powers of governing bodies and whether if the governing body decides that they will allow religious instruction, I don't know whether they can decide that, and whether because the Schools Act says they can't have religious instruction, then the governing body can't decide that they want to have religious instruction. That's the way I understand it. The governing body has to abide by
as I've stated, within the context of the school curriculum, the CAPS curriculum, the teaching, the content therein, you cannot, you should not be actually using that as an opportunity for religious instruction, for proselytization or anything like that. But that having said, of course, as I've mentioned, should the policy allow, and should say, for example, Scripture Union be invited in to speak at an assembly or whatever it might happen to be, the school governing body would be allowed to make that call, to have that sort of policy. Obviously, not to make it difficult or uncomfortable for learners who don't want to or don't believe or don't want to participate. So there are the checks and balances involved, definitely, within the OGOD judgment.
And perhaps the other ultimate goal that I set out with this conversation, and I do think we achieved that, Michael. I don't see any blood flowing. I never got angry at you. I think that modeling that this type of conversation can be had is very important. I'm a committed atheist. I believe that you're a committed Christian. And despite the fact that we still I think you have a little bit of difference in interpretation, and there was pushback on both sides. I think we had a civil.
Let me correct something. In the context that I'm sitting speaking with you now, as Freedom of Religion South Africa, I am faith neutral. So your rights as somebody who chooses not to believe are as valuable, as important, as worthy of protection as anybody else of any other faith. Your particular version of faith, what you believe and whatever I believe, is actually irrelevant in this context. I believe what we need to be considering are the legal aspects, the legal implications.
Sorry, yes, I agree, and I will. I made a poster not too long ago where I said I will defend your child's right to freedom of religion with the same vehemence that I would defend my child's right to not be religious, because to me that is the foundation of a free and democratic society. That
is the correct constitutional viewpoint and interpretation. Absolutely.
Yes, and I think that should. Oh, sorry, I just have a question here. Maybe I can. Do you mind? Can I keep you for a bit longer, Michael?
I'll keep you for about another 2 minutes because
No, then you have. I have a question here from Gert van Heerden. Let me put it up on the screen. Would a school with a majority Christian parents governing body be allowed to refuse speaker of other faiths at schools? And I think the key there is be allowed to refuse speakers. That's basically the question I asked earlier. And I think you're going to say yes, Michael.
Well, I'm going to say, what does the school governing body's policy direct or dictate? It must, bear in mind, as I said to you, it must be equitable. It doesn't mean equal, but it doesn't mean that you can say, look, we're on the governing body, we're sort of 51% Islamic, and therefore we're not going to allow any other faith to have any opportunity whatsoever. That would be in conflict with this judgment.
That would be in conflict with the judgment.
If that is happening, it shouldn't happen, and it means that their policy will need to be probably adjusted to make sure that it is in line with the judgment, because that wouldn't be equitable.
So, Gert, you have your answer, I hope. I think it's a clear answer. Michael, if you have 2 minutes left, then I think I'm going to thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. We might do this again sometime and have a little bit more of a personal discussion. I'd like that too. I hope you had COVID. I hope you completely recover. And your wife, who is currently under the weather, I hope she recovers. And I still hope that within the next not too distant future, we could have a face-to-face meeting. Maybe you can come to Worcester. It's lovely in the Boland. When there's snow on the mountains, which is hopefully soon, then and if you're ever in the
many times.
Sorry?
It is a beautiful place, and I've been there several times.
Yes, you're welcome anytime when you're in the vicinity. Pop round for a coffee. It was lovely talking to you. Thank you so much for your time. And I will post the link to this conversation, and you can also share it far and wide. Thank you so much, and all the best to you, Michael.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Daar sê vir die 9 mense wat lewendig saam met ons hier was. Baie dankie. As jy bloed in darmes en gore verwag het, dan het jy dit nie gekry nie. En dan is ek jammer vir jou. Dit is nie my doel nie. Dis nie wat ek graag wil doen nie. Ek hoop om 'n bietjie van 'n langer lyn te loop, en die belangriker uitkoms vir my is werklik om te demonstreer dat 'n mens hierdie gesprekke kan hê sonder om mekaar aan die keel te gryp. Al voel 'n mens partykeer gefrustreerd en geïrriteerd, en glo vir my, ek raak ewig geïrriteerd. I get heavily frustrated and irritated. I'm switching to English because I would just like to do a shout out to Esther, the Afro-humanist. I met Esther on Sunday night. Please check out her channel on YouTube, the Afro-humanist. I have to plug Esther. So Esther, Sorry for the Afrikaans that I used. I forgot my audience for a moment there. I would like to be international. So yes, thank you for the positive comments. This will be posted online. Let's just mention one thing. If you want change, you have to be willing to stick out your neck a little bit. I know that there is the distinct possibility, if as a parent you say that you're atheist and you say that you don't want your child to attend religious observances, you can feel that you will be victimized against, or your child will be victimized against, and it can happen. What makes it insidious is that it can be in very many subtle ways. And it's a complicated issue, and it depends greatly on your child. I have 3, and they each responded differently to the issue of religion in schools and how they were indoctrinated, because they were indoctrinated. The tide is changing, but it is a slow, long haul. And the expectation should be that. So I want to ask everybody out there to please join us in normalizing secular humanism, in promoting skepticism, but in such a way that we do not drive people away and that we adhere to the correct values. And I really meant what I said when I said that I will fight for the right of people of religion to express their views in the public forum, to the same extent that I will fight to have my rights, to have the right to express my beliefs. Having said that, in the public school environment, taking into account that South Africa is not a secular society, we have to change the atmosphere. We have to change the everyday goings on. But please remember that often the only way to do that is to say what you believe and why you believe it, and be civil about it, and deal with whatever the consequences are as they happen, because sometimes they won't even happen. And if you need any help, if you would like me to talk to your child's teacher, if you would like me to have a discussion with your child's governing body, that's what I do. That's what I like doing. And sometimes we actually do get things done. So yes, one of the ways that you can contribute to normalizing secular humanism is invite a secular humanist to your child's school. So approach the principal, approach the life orientation teacher, ask them, tell them you know people who can talk to the kids about critical thinking skills. If you would like to invite me, I can do it in person within 100-kilometer or so radius of Worcester. If you want to pay my ticket to fly wherever, I'll do that too. But I also have a series of videos that can be used by educators. Encourage your child's teacher to show them other people's point of view. That is an important value, and it's essential for a fair and open and democratic society. And on that note, I will say good night. Thank you for watching. I hope to do this again, hopefully in person one of these days, with a panel discussion on this topic. This will not be the last time we speak about this. I will attempt to get Jaco Deacon of FETSAS on the channel, because I think there's more to say about this. I will also try to get a Department of Education official to speak about the rights and the powers of governing bodies. On that promising note, wish me luck getting hold of somebody from the Department of Education. But let's not give up. Thank you for your time. Thank you for watching. And I hope to see you here again in the not too distant future. Hamba Gashle.